Well, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. I want to apologize with the technical difficulties we've had. So we're going to be recording this, and this is what you're seeing. This is the recording of our interview this evening. But we're glad that you can join us. We're excited to um, be able to present this on a very important subject, but it's something of more of celebration as well, and bringing awareness of the various cultures that we've been presenting this year with the Provo City School District and our speaker series events. And so this month is Asian American Pacific Islander Month. And so I'm excited to be able to have three amazing gentlemen join me this night to talk about the culture, history, and some of the issues that our Asian community is facing. And especially for folks like myself that is trying to learn as much as possible. This is valuable. And so I'm glad to have these three gentlemen to be able to spend some time and to talk about the culture of Asian people. So tonight I have my good friend Max Chang, John Arthur, and Emilio Camus to share their thoughts and their perspectives on this subject matter. So we'll just go ahead and dive right into this, gentlemen, because we have a lot to talk about. And so I want to ask you all just kind of real briefly to kind of maybe share with everybody, first of all, a little bit about yourself, and then your feelings about being Asian. I think, I can definitely talk about being a Native American, but I think it'd be interesting to hear your feelings about being Asian. So Max, we'll start off with you.
Brian, thank you for having us. My name is Max Chang. I am a Taiwanese American born here in Salt Lake City. And although it's not quantified, it's very likely I am the first Taiwanese American born here in Utah. What is it like to be Asian? Wow. In Utah, I think that it really reflects on a national scale. And there's three themes that I've always really referred to. The first is something that has really been taught by my UC Berkeley professor, Ling-Chi Wang, who is one of the pivotal people to help start the ethics studies program here in the United States. And he says, if there's one word that describes the Chinese American and Asian American experience, it's exclusion. The second theme is also really from my professor, Ron Tataki at UC Berkeley, who wrote a book called Strangers from a Different Shore. And that really helps, really talk about the perpetual foreignness of Asians, whether they've been here since as early as 1869 here in Utah that we can document, or if they are third or fourth generation, or if they just were born here, like first generation like myself, or just recently immigrated. We are nonetheless perpetual foreigners. And finally, the third, and these are not the only themes, there's a lot more than this, is the scapegoat factor. And we see this in history that a lot of times when there are economic downturns, for example, shortly after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, or even today, let me go back. After the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, the Chinese were often referred to as the Chinese question or the Chinese problem, because they were being used, even though they're a very small percentage of the workforce, they were the cause of all these economic woes, which eventually led to the 1882 Exclusion Act. Today, a lot of people are saying, what is the Chinese problem? And the Chinese problem right now is coronavirus. So it's really, mirroring itself on these two ends of the spectrum of Asian American history. So oftentimes I see Asian Americans as scapegoats, whether it's Vincent Chin being killed for, even though he was Chinese American, was being killed for from two other auto workers who thought he was Japanese, and blaming him for the woes of Detroit's auto industry at the time in 1982 to all these things. So those are my three themes that I've repeatedly encountered throughout my life.
Thank you, Max. Emilio, what are your thoughts?
Well, hi, thank you, Brian, for having me as part of this awesome panel. My name is Emilio Manuel Camu. I serve as the current president for OCA Asian Pacific Islander American Advocates Utah, which is the local chapter of the National Civil Rights and Advocacy Organization, focusing on the social, political, and economic betterment for all 150,000 plus Asians and Pacific Islanders. And like you said earlier, happy Asian and Pacific Islander Heritage Month to everyone listening into this today. So for myself, I'm an immigrant. I came to the U.S. around 2001 and ended up going to Salt Lake City and going through its public schools. So I grew up in the Granite School District and then to the University of Utah, where I took ethnic studies and minored in Asian Pacific Islander studies, as well as took part in the oldest Asian American college student organization in the state at the University of Utah. I think for me, being Tagalog and Bicolnon, which are ethnic groups in the Philippines, and being an immigrant, when I was growing up through the public school system, Asian itself, was used as an identifier. Not for me, it wasn't something I used, it was something that was used on me. And I think, that describes a lot of the experience. And I think through the knowledge in the classes that I was able to come to an understanding for myself that Asian American itself is a political identity. When I use it now, when I use Asian American or tell other folks Asian American, it's a signifier for me that, I understand and I'm familiar with the complex histories of, the more than 50 or more than 100 plus ethnic groups and their histories in the United States. Not that I'm an expert, but it's a growing understanding of what our, different communities are like. And I think for me, it means that, I have to come to terms and I have to really understand what the history is of Asians, not just of Filipinos, but of all Asians in the state of Utah. And what, like Max said earlier, it has been a history of exclusion. It has been a history of systemic oppression, not just for Asians, but, the same system that keeps other minoritized folks down. So for me, this identifying with a term that is connected to political experience, Asian American itself and being Asian is very political. It is very for me a signifier of commitment that we are not just Asian for being Asian. We are Asian and understand the difficult and complex history of our people within the United States and within Utah.
Wow, thank you. That's a lot. I really learned right off the bat. I'm learning some things here. So thank you, Emilio. John, what's your thoughts on this?
Thank you, Brian. And just so everybody knows who I am, my name is John Arthur. I'm a 6th grade school teacher here in Salt Lake City. I'm also the 2021 Utah Teacher of the Year. I'm half Korean, I'm biracial. My mother's Korean and my father was a soldier patrolling the DMZ between the North and the South, and fell in love with a wonderful woman from Tokori. And I'm grateful that he did, because, that question of how do I feel about being Asian? I feel fantastic about it. I love being Asian. And there are problematic pieces to lumping everyone from the Earth's largest landmass all together in one group. But as an individual, it's allowed me to connect with beautiful cultures that I otherwise might not have an inroad to. I get to go to various festivals and all the various cultural celebrations and get to say, yeah, I'm Asian too. And these are my people, and it's so rich and speaks to the elders in our community and the traditions that they have brought with them. As someone whose mother came to the United States and having been raised here, I look at that as a bridge back to this beautiful history and land that I've wanted to connect to more, especially as I've gotten older. When I was younger, I didn't feel that way. It wasn't until I was a teenager that I finally embraced this title of Korean. I would just say, hi, I'm John, I'm from Utah, now I'm John, I'm Korean American. And it's one of the things I'm most proud of and excited to share with people.
It was so eloquently said, John. I appreciate that. I mean, it really, there are so many similarities that we have with our cultures. And as you were kind of explaining, I think that that's what's so wonderful about learning about culture, is that there's so many things that how it kind of brings us together. Even though we are different and we come from different heritage, but it's so kind of I can definitely call you a brother, because it's just that connection. And
Yeah.
that's what's so beautiful about diversity. And so thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
So Max, I want to switch it to you because we were kind of looking at a particular day to have this. And there is an importance of this particular day of May 10th. And I want to kind of turn it over to you for a little bit to kind of share with you, or to kind of share with everybody a little bit of the history of why this day is significant, but also a little bit of the history of the Asian community here in Utah.
Well, exactly 152 years ago today on May 10th, a golden spike was driven into a polished laurel tie, signifying the completion of the nation's first transcontinental railroad. While the champagne shot by Andrew Russell is really probably the most well-known photograph of the 19th century, what it excludes is probably more telling than what it includes, and that is the thousands of Chinese railroad workers who, without them, who conquered the Sierra Mountains, the tunneling 15 tunnels to the hardest surface found on North America, granite, they probably would not have completed this railroad. And they were excluded, but yet they still stayed. Many of them stayed to continuously do maintenance on the railroad. We see them both on the Central Pacific side and also on the Union Pacific side. There's quite a great picture of 4 Chinese men on one of those carts, that's kind of a push cart, maintaining the railroad just outside in Echo Canyon on the way between Echo and Evanston. So we know that the Chinese stayed, and ultimately they were really the first of major significant numbers to come to Utah, and that was actually in 1869, just 22 years after the Mormon pioneers came through that same canyon of Echo Canyon and eventually through Parley's Canyon to Salt Lake City, where this is the place. I'm just kind of jump for the sake of time some major events of immigration here to Utah by Asian American groups, and certainly it's not all encompassing, or certain events. The next one I really wanted to talk about is the Japanese American experience, where in 1942, February 16th, I think, or something around there, where President Theodore Roosevelt signed the Executive Order 9066, which basically interned or incarcerated Japanese Americans and those of Japanese descent along the West Coast into 14 concentration camps across the West, including one in Topaz, Utah, which is just outside of Delta. And now there, many people, they lost their property, their civil rights, their everything, their humanity for that matter, and were put in these camps. At the same time, there's a positive story around that same time, and that is of Wat Masaka. Wat Masaka was born and raised, Japanese American, born and raised in Ogden. He played for Weber College at the time. For 2 years, was one of their most prolific scorers before he transferred to the University of Utah. Now, I want you to think about this. And during World War II, the University of Utah had a Japanese American basketball player who led them to 2 national championships, one during the war, which was the NCAA championship, which at the time was less prominent than the NIT championship. He then left for 2 years to serve in the US Army as a special agent, actually in Japan during the occupation, and then came back. But when he came back, his teammates like Arnie Farron, who remained a good friend throughout their entire life, got their spots back on the team, got their numbers, but but Watt did not get his number. They already gave away his number for that matter. But he was the defensive stalwart in the national championship game against Kentucky, where he defended the player of the year to just 4 points. And when they said, I'm paraphrasing this, they said, of all the players who were heroes of this game, one stood out like a sore thumb, and that was Watt Misaka. And so we're proud that part of our work is we worked with the athletic director, Mark Harlan, a couple of years, last year in 2019, where he gave an exception to the rules of jersey retirement and announced that Watt Misaka's number, which was taken away from him between the two championships, will forever hang in the rafters of the Huntsman Center. Now, moving forward, and this also at the 1942 time is when they finally repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and where it was the first and only time that immigration was restricted strictly based on race. But they set a quota for, again, as John said, the largest landmass to only 200 people a year from that area. So it was not until the 1965 Immigration Act that they could have more and more people come. And my father came to the United States just prior to the 1965 Immigration Act as part of what we call the brain drain of Asia, where the United States got some of the best scholars, academics, to come to the United States to major universities across the country as part of really to help develop and further enhance their research and development, but also to work on top secret military projects. The next major immigration I would like to talk about is following in the Vietnam War, and then the influx of refugees from Southeast Asia. And Utah was one of the more welcoming communities, and thus we have a stronger Southeast Asian presence here. Now, this is not to discount or disregard all the immigration from other countries. We have over 50 ethnicities within the Asian American experience. And so many of them here have come just 22 years. People don't even understand that just 22 years after the pioneers came, we already had Chinese in Utah. And there are some incidences, I talked about the good and some of the bad, but there were Chinatowns throughout, most notably in Corinne, Salt Lake, and Park City. In Corinne was a good number of prostitutes from China because women were not allowed to come in as part of the one of the acts, but I can't remember the name off the top of my head. And then in Salt Lake City, yes, Page Act, thank you, Emilio. And then in Salt Lake City, we did have a Chinatown Plum Alley, which is just right next to Regent Street, where the current Echo Theater is. It's now a parking lot. But they were raided all the time. And this is part of what we see as systemic racism. They were raided because they were not up to health code. But it is not, but the city itself would not put in sewer lines. They would not put in the infrastructure that other areas would get. In Park City, a lot of them were miners, part of the mining boom in Park City. And there's a mine in Grass Creek, which is just directly across from what is now Echo Reservoir. The reservoir did not exist back at that time. And then a lot of you, if you go to Park City, if you go for Sundance and so forth, you see the area called China Bridge. And that's where the parking lot is just kind of, east of Main Street. And in China Bridge, people didn't realize that bridge was built over Chinatown so the white people would not have to walk through Chinatown. And youngsters, teenagers or so what, thought it was funny to take snowballs and drop them in stovepipes into the Chinese workers' houses, which would immediately extinguish their stove, but would create basically a smoke bomb. And they will laugh as the Chinese were basically suffocating and had to evacuate their homes. So unfortunately, there is some sad stories. There are obviously some triumphs, and there are obviously some great Asian Americans who have come from Utah and have done great things for Utah. But these persistent themes have been here since 1869 to 2021. And that is a very brief overview.
Wow. Thank you, Max. That's again, that's quite a bit right there. And it's probably, you're only giving just a small sample of the history. And so thank you for that. So I want to kind of shift now a little bit, and I want to go into issues. Because I think this is something we need to address. And all of you come from different parts. And so I want to give you some time to kind of share with you, or have you share with us, some of the things you've seen as you do your work, and some of the challenges that the Asian community is facing, the youth, the kids. John, I mean, I know that you see that directly. So I want to dive into that and give you some time to now kind of share your perspective on this. So Emilio, I'm going to give you some time right now to share with us some of the things that you've seen, that you've encountered, the work that you do, and kind of help us to kind of understand the issues that you're seeing.
Definitely, and I think I'd like to speak on the fact. So I also work in higher education as a student affairs professional. So I work at the University of Utah, but we'll be transferring to Utah Valley University pretty soon, working with first-gen students. And I think for myself, what I see with Asian American students is that because they're seen as just Asian, and not people aren't disaggregating the data or not understanding that there are more than 50 or 100 different ethnicities within that group of varying histories and experiences within Utah, that they fail to fully understand the complete story of students. And when that happens, we fail to provide the adequate resources and needs to address what students need in order to be able to thrive on campuses for their education. So I think this aggregation of data is something that is super important to understand, and why that is a key component to what we're fighting for as our nonprofit does, in order to be able to understand the complete story of what our 150,000 Asians and Pacific Islanders are experiencing in the state. I think many of the modern narratives, right, including the model minority myth, helps erase the experiences of this myth saying that that Asians are good, Asians are successful, Asians haven't gone through any oppression. Erases the oppression that they have experienced, particularly especially within Utah's history, including the concentration camps, including the Exclusion Act, including Filipino servants at the University of Utah. And so I think that's something that's definitely noteworthy of saying, is making sure that we challenge this idea of Asians being a monolith. Additionally, I think in terms of particularly for healthcare, particularly for Filipinos, in the whole US, right, we're going through a COVID-19 pandemic still 1 year later, and 1/3, right, of all nurse deaths in the US have been nurses of Filipino descent. And this deals with the complicated, and infuriating history between the brain drain that Max was talking about, but also how systemic this really is. How nursing schools and finishing schools and education schools were set up in the Philippines during the time of the American Commonwealth in the Philippines, and how they had specific routes even for planes from Manila to Chicago to make sure that the Philippines supplies the nursing shortages in the US. I think additionally, in terms of well-being, working with young adults and youth, we see that mental health is a topic, right, that needs to be addressed, to address this feeling of exclusion, this feeling of invisibility and erasure, but to also compound that with the fact that we need to do a class analysis of this. Where are these people coming from? Who is experiencing different kinds of mental health? And this is stemming from the refugees and war. And for Filipino Americans, the past 100 years, in their blood. We talk about intergenerational trauma. They've gone through the Philippine American War, World War I. They've gone through World War II and what the American occupation and Japanese imperialism at the same time, and all of these different things that really affect people and come out and manifest in different ways that we can also see among refugees, right, from the 70s, the Khmer, the Laotian, the Hmong, and even the 90s and 2000s with the refugees coming from Myanmar who fled to Thailand, from the Bhutanese, Nepalese folks who came from Bhutan, escaped to Nepal, couldn't find a home, and are here. And so that's something that that we're facing, and this issue also of for Asians and Pacific Islanders, we share multilingual nations, multilingual ethnic groups. And so people wanting to be civically engaged is what we've seen, and people wanting to participate not just in the political process, but in their neighborhoods and in any key decision making, but are finding it hard because of the language access there is. I think in contrast with the Latino community, the Latinx community, Spanish is usually the go-to, but there isn't necessarily one unifying language for Asians. And I think that's the beauty in our communities that isn't necessarily captured by the systems and the agencies that are trying to serve us. And so there's a very big disconnect, in what the community wants to do and what is available out there. Because oftentimes, especially for our community organization working on COVID-19 testing and vaccines and providing that for a community, people usually ask us, well, what's our 1 or 2 languages that you think you'll need service for? And we're like, well, that's hard for us to pinpoint because it depends on what part of, what Asian are you talking about then? And is it really for all Asians, or are you trying to target a specific group? Is it for low-income Asians? Is it for non-English speakers? What is the framework that we're doing here? And I think that's something for us in terms of language that we need to address. And I think other key issues is the fact that I think especially now during this time, right, of Stop Asian Hate, people saying that it's now time for the Asian community to rise. And for me, I would like to challenge that, because Asian Americans, Asian folks in the U.S. have been voicing or using their voice and fighting for civil rights and for liberation for decades. And that's something that that I would want to challenge and make sure that we're understanding, and making sure that we are providing the context and the history, because I think for me, being in education, I had to seek out ethnic studies. I had to seek out Asian American studies just to be able to learn about my people in a college setting, which for many low-income Southeast Asian, refugee, South Asian, is not accessible, right? And I think also making sure, I'm going to go back to my first point of challenging this idea that Asians are monolith. We forget that LGBTQ Asians exist. We forget that LGBT and undocumented Asians exist. People of varying and mixed status, people coming, from multiracial families, adoptees. I think that's something that we have to keep in mind as we are talking about, this vast group of people. But when they put it in number, right, like, well, it's 150,000, or for Asians, 90,000. That's like 1.5 or 1.8% of the state's total population. Okay, but these are people, right? These are people with names, with stories, with complex histories that make up our communities.
I appreciate you saying that, Emilio, because that's definitely something we don't think about. And it's interesting, some of the things that you were saying. I was actually in a couple of meetings today that, languages. So I think somebody was bringing up, well, what are those, what are the languages that we need to highlight or to, have for the Asian community? And I thought it was kind of a weird question, but, but you bring that up. I want to ask you, because I think with some of our smaller ethnic populations, do you think because there isn't like a large population that, over the past, for a while here, maybe here in the state, that I think it's just has not been a priority? I mean, the large, you know, the larger population that we have here in Utah is Latino. But for the smaller populations, and I even throw a Native American into that mix, and our Black and African American community as well. I mean, it's not like a large number at this point. It's growing, it's changing, the demographics are changing. But do you think here in the state that maybe because of the size that we kind of have forgotten, maybe in some ways, some of these different groups, and so we kind of get overlooked? I mean, do you kind of see that as maybe one of the issues?
I think for me, it's a question of who has forgotten, because I think our communities definitely have not. And I think that's why our communities always work so strong with each other. For Asian, for Pacific Islander, for Black, for Native, for Latinx. I think we haven't forgotten our histories, and we haven't forgotten each other. I think the mainstream narrative definitely has. I think how it's structured and how it's taught in schools hasn't been like, the curricula for schools in K through 12 and in higher ed haven't necessarily seen or valued it. But I think in my experience, our elders in the community, our elders in different spaces have not forgotten and rely on our relationship building. And I think that's what's great, particularly for me being part of different Asian community organizations, is that we enter this space in the community where our elders and previous folks who have organized have created great relationships with each other, that we're able to have those connections. And I think that's what we thrive. I think it's on the mainstream and what is being taught, and those who are making decisions who aren't part of our communities for the most part, who are the ones that are they're the ones that are forgetting who we are, and it's unfortunate.
Yeah. Thank you, Emilio. So John, Emilio has kind of started the discussion about education. We're facing some challenges here in the state, around the country, when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion. Some folks feel, uneasy about having this in our schools. But as we've kind of listened tonight, at least from my perspective, I've learned a lot about, already about, some of the struggles, the history of the Asian people. So as an educator, and using yourself as our state teacher of the year, from your professional experience, I mean, what are some of the things you've seen that you've struggled with as an educator that we could do better at here in Utah?
One of the things that we could definitely do better is providing entryways into conversations about the history of Asian Americans and Asian excellence in Utah and in our country. If you look at our educational standards, what teachers look at to know what to teach in their classrooms, there just aren't any real doorways into covering that content. Social studies is already neglected, and it's hard enough to find opportunities as a classroom teacher to bring that in because it's not a tested subject. And so when we're talking about communities that have been forgotten, it's not just that they've been forgotten, they've been neglected. Our kids have not had opportunities to see their stories told in class and to have their accomplishments and contributions held up as the examples of American excellence, right? And it's always a little bit difficult as an Asian American because to complain or to bring it up, because so often our community is looked at through the lens of that model minority myth as you're good. Like, you have no room to complain. You guys are doing well. Look at your academic outcomes. You like, what do you want? You're doing well in school. And it's one of those pieces where, like Emilio was saying, we're not all doing well in school. You have not disaggregated the data to see how differences between different communities, whether it's East Asian, Southeast Asian, South Asian, West Asian, how each of those groups are doing. Because I tell you, there's a world of difference that I see as a teacher with the students in my class between a kid whose parents had to flee from their country, who fled away from their homeland, and those who left in pursuit through their own free will and choice a life here in the United States. Those who came over as refugees typically do not do as well academically as those who came over as immigrants, who just came over in pursuit of a better life. And there are so many reasons that explain how our different communities came here, and yet their specific needs are neglected because it's just assumed that you are from another place. And it doesn't matter the story or the context of how you came. It's just that you're here, you're from this place. According to our test data, you all do pretty well in school. So just, be quiet and hold yourselves up as that paragon. Be proud of the fact that you do well. And, you talk about conversations we've been having in education lately. Max, Emilio, and I are constantly in these. And you love to hear people talk about equality. Like that's what we ought to have in our schools. It's like, okay, cool, equality. Then teach all of our histories as they flow into American history equally. Oh, but you're only 5% or 2% of the population. Okay, give me 5% of the social studies curriculum as Asian, right? That's still better than zero. The place where we're at is so pitiful that the crumbs that people often offer to our community or others are still better than what we've got. And it's really tragic. And I'll just share this as a personal anecdote. I was talking about the need to talk about the accomplishments and contributions of Asians in our country. And I was talking about this with my father, who fell in love with a Korean woman, and even he, having had more exposure to Korean history and to Korean American history and Asian history in the United States, more than most, even he asked me, what contributions are you exactly talking about? And at the time we were walking among the cherry blossoms in the tidal basin. I went back to visit my family in Washington, D.C. And I couldn't help but just laugh and look at my dad and say, Dad, look at where we're at. We're walking through these cherry blossoms that were donated by the mayor of Tokyo to Washington, D.C. because of the involvement of a Japanese American biochemist named Takamine Jokichi. And his love of America and Japan helped facilitate this gift that we are now enjoying the shade of. And more interestingly, Dad, that scientist is the first person to have isolated and extracted the hormone adrenaline, otherwise known as epinephrine, which my daughter relies on to hopefully one day save her life should she accidentally consume a tree nut. I literally depend on the contribution of a Japanese American scientist for the health and safety of my child. And there are countless stories like this throughout our history. They're just not taught. We don't, I've said this before, we don't suffer from a lack of accomplishment. We suffer from a lack of acknowledgement. And the only place to really build in that acknowledgement is not in pop culture or in social media. It's in our schools. Our kids need to grow up learning about the excellence of their classmates, and kids from our community need to see in the curriculum their own excellence so they can have pride as Asians in our communities. There's nothing in school that makes our kids proud right now of who they are. And that is a tragedy. And that's one of the things that we all have to commit ourselves to improving, giving our kids chances to feel pride while in school as Asians.
Thanks, John. Wow, some very powerful words. And I agree. I think you said the word crumbs. And unfortunately, we're kind of at that when we talk about sharing just history of what our various ethnicities, our groups have contributed to our country. For my as a Native American, the Navajo code talkers, for example, is not taught. And how many people were saved by the heroic things that, the code talkers did in World War II. And what people don't realize is that there was more than just Navajos that were code talkers. There were other tribal communities, tribes that had code talkers as well. That's not taught, and it needs to be taught. And so I thank you for those comments. And Max, and this is where I want to shift to you, because as you know, we've been kind of dealing on this subject, and since we're kind of on an education base, we'll kind of focus on that. There's hesitation, I guess, where where culture seems to be something that, I don't know, maybe has not been of an importance, or even at this time, even for some folks, should not be taught in schools. And which is, I think, for myself, I'm having a difficult time understanding that. Like I just mentioned, why isn't the Navajo code talkers taught in schools? Contributions from all of the various groups. I mean, we've all contributed to the history of this country, and have made an impact in this country, but yet the hesitation of wanting that to be taught in our schools. And so, you've been on a lot of discussions with this, panel discussions. And so, what do you think, why? What's the hesitation? What do we need to do to change that, mindset, and so that we can better educate our children?
Well, the first thing I'd like to, kind of say is that a lot of this is stemming from the unknown. It's not familiar to them. And when it's not familiar, there can be a lot of crazy ideas. Going back, maybe 10 years, DirecTV had this ad campaign. It says, well, if you get cable, you're going to end up in a ditch. And it's really kind of this whole slippery slope thing. You don't get cable, you get angry, you take out your anger at the badminton court, you get a patch on your eye from the ER, you're on a bus, and these guys think you're tough, so they chase you and you end up in a ditch. And so that's what I kind of feel sometimes with the equity, diversity, and inclusion, that it's almost has been turned into 4-letter words. And I kind of laughed. It says, there are people who say we had to be against the anti-racist diversity and inclusion concepts. Well, both in English and in math, a double negative makes that we're pro-racist. If you're against anti-racist. If you're against diversity, you're looking for homogeneity. And if you're against inclusion, it goes back to my theme of exclusion. So one thing that I've been doing the last few years, 2 years ago, I actually created my own program, a teaching lesson on the Transcontinental Railroad, specifically on the Chinese railroad workers' contribution to building this railroad. And I make a very simple fact that if this railroad was not built, it could not have been built without the Chinese through the Sierra Mountains. But if it was not built, the United States to become a superpower would have been greatly delayed or may not have ever occurred, because it linked 2 great oceans, physically and literally the country. So I've created these lessons over time, and I don't believe it should just be limited to social studies, for example. I believe in the arts, literary, and so I have 2 children in elementary school now. So the past few years, I've created an author study program, and I actually want to share a couple of these books. So for this month, and I've started as early as 2nd grade or even 1st grade. Actually, this year I even went to kindergarten with my Lupita Nyong'o book called Sulue, which is about her struggle of accepting her dark skin. And those things could be read. So first I'm going to be teaching, I don't know if you can see this, is Eyes That Kiss the Corners. And we know that maybe a lot of us have
Hey, Max, you're muted, brother. I think you accidentally hit it.
all right. Am I back? Okay. So in any case, so we all had this, not all, but that's why we had this type of insult thrown to us. And one of my friends who is a Broadway dancer shared with me that one of our tryouts, they said, okay, we're all going to tape our eyes back to be part of the performance. The second book I've been using is called Chicken of the Sea. This was written by my classmate and friend and fellow activist at UC Berkeley, Viet Thanh Nguyen, who won the Pulitzer Prize for his book, The Sympathizer. He wrote it with his then 5-year-old son. And I wanted to show these kids and also illustrated by a mother and son duo, Vietnamese American illustrators. And I just wanted to show the kids the ability of what a young person could do. And this kind of goes without my knowing it, but John educated me maybe last week, that this is really windows and mirrors, that we are allowing our students the opportunity to see windows and out to different communities and different things that are not themselves. And they are so accepting at this young age. They are excited by it. They love hearing these different things about it. And then mirrors. For those who have not seen themselves and just like Lupita Nyong'o says, she was not in Rapunzel. There's no one like a Rapunzel or Cinderella or Snow White. And she felt like dark-skinned people didn't belong. And yet she later became an Oscar winner. She later became people's most beautiful person in the year. And she's a supermodel. She's a tremendous actress. And those are the things we want to share, that those inspirational stories, like John said, that we can show a lot of the things that have indeed represented systemic racism, and they should be taught. But we should celebrate the accomplishments like Wat Nasaka here in Utah, or Mini Okubu, a great artist who was in Topaz and used her art to help document things, to tell the stories. So I really strongly believe that arts education, whether it's through literary, through drama, through music, through illustration, those are things that help really create common ground. Common and not so necessarily the slippery slope battlefield that a lot of the adults want to play on. And we need to come and say, let's soften this. Let's see these little entry points. And it makes our children much more diverse. They have a much broader, I think, whole brain thinking, not just snippets of what they see. And then as we create and the reality is we are in a global economy. We have become closer and closer to technology, that we will train our students, this is my strong belief, we will train our students to become better stewards of this planet. And as they go out and travel the world and earn and become very successful, we hope that they will come back to Utah, reinvest their capital, whether it's money, whether it's their intelligence, whether it's their cultural upbringings, everything. Reinvest in this great state. I believe this is a great state. I have always said that, even though people say, you live in Utah, that's such a racist place. I go, wait a minute, I can say that, but you can't, you've never been there. And so I'm a great defender of the state, but I also believe we can improve.
I totally agree with that, Max. I mean, I love this state. Moving to Utah is one of the best things that we ever did. But we can do better, and that's what it's all about, is let's do better. So I want to shift it now to a current subject matter that we're all also dealing with, or that the Asian community is dealing with, and that is the xenophobia, the hate. I think we touched about it a little bit early on in this, but the trauma that is being experienced through the Asian community. I know our advisory committee, our Asian advisory committee, are very concerned about things that have happened, things that are happening to family members and friends, as they go shopping. Remarks will be made, bullying will take place with maybe some of their children. But, you know, if you can if one of you can kind of maybe just talk about the trauma that's being caused because of, you know, this I guess hatred a little bit maybe towards the Asian community because of COVID. Anybody want to have an answer for that?
I just have really one word, and then I would like to turn over to both either John or Emilio. But this is really an example of the scapegoat portion that I've been talking about.
Emilio, John, do you have anything you want to add?
Emilio, go for it, buddy. I'll go. Okay, I'll go. So I think Max is, really hit it on the head, with this virus that besieged and just decimated the world. Someone needed to be blamed for it, and political forces decided it would be Asians, and specifically people from China. But unfortunately, again, folks here don't understand the nuance of the various groups, and that was already wrong. But that just became a crime that was committed by all Asians in the eyes of anybody who isn't able to discern one group from another, which, has led me to this point where for the first time in my life, I've felt fear walking the streets with my mother. Like I said, I went to those cherry blossoms with her, and while she was looking up at the buds in the trees, I was watching the crowd, scanning for signs of hate on a person's face or movement in her direction. As we were there, I couldn't help but replay in the back of my mind video of elderly Asian women attacked randomly on the streets, and I couldn't help but picture my mother as the next victim. And I have not been subjected to physical violence. My mother hasn't, and yet I'm playing these things out in my mind, and they are affecting me deeply. And it's, far worse for her and every other woman, elderly member of our community, and really our children. Max has heard me tell this story many times of a student who was slapped on the playground by his friend who thought he was slapping the coronavirus off of him. Hate has become a game for children because it's just out there so prevalently. And this is a place where Asian Americans can make an impact because it's political leaders who have spread the rhetoric of this hate that has fed it and fueled it. And there is a clear need in our community to get more politically active and make sure that the candidates that we are backing and that are being elected aren't doing that, are not guilty of promulgating this hatred against our community. We are a small community percentage wise, but we are influential and we do have power. And it's time that we start using it more in Utah and across the country to put our foot down and say candidates who have talked about the China virus or the Kung flu are not people that will be supported by our community. This is a time for us to become more vocal. We've, like Emilio said, we've been rising for decades and for a century. The rule in U.S. code and law that says that anyone that was born here in the United States as a U.S. citizen came from a Supreme Court case involving a Chinese American, a man who was born here in the United States and then went back to China, wasn't allowed to come back. That precedent came from his case, him stepping up and saying, no, I'm American, which entitles me to certain inalienable rights, and I'm going to fight for them. We need to do more of that right now.
Thanks, John. Emilio, do you have anything you want to add?
Oh yeah, I think when we talk about this, and I'm glad that that we are talking about this. But for others, they think that this is just, the rise of anti-Asian hate, anti-Asian sentiments, as influenced by, the ongoing national narrative that was set last year on the onset of the pandemic. But for me, I think it's really important to understand that this is just the most recent reiteration of anti-Asian violence. We saw it against the South Asians and West Asians, the Sikh community after 9/11. We saw it again, 40s during the concentration camps, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Philippine Exclusion Act, or the Tidings-McDuffie Act, as it's more popularly known. And I think we really need to examine the historic violence that has taken place against Asians, and what the history and the cause for immigration into the United States looks like. Additionally, I think it's been time for our communities to call into accountability why this is happening to us, and we have people who are invested in the community, who have been part of these different community organizations in the state, and have continued to push this for decades. I think it's just a matter of listening to them. If those are the people that are in power, that are needing to understand what needs to be done, listen to what decades of Asian community organizing and leaders have said. And I think what we do see, right, that's been heightened during the pandemic is that not just racism but sexism, classism, really is not or is working against our communities for us to be able to be a thriving community, in the sense that even though people want to be involved, even though people would love to invest more time and commitment in our communities, but I think what we see, right, particularly for those who are low income, for those from a lower socioeconomic status, that they are not able to dedicate as much time because of the need to provide for their children, for their families, for their extended families, not just here, but in different states and perhaps back in their motherlands. And so I think that's something that we need to take into consideration, is that we're not just looking at Stop Asian Hate as one moment in history, but as a moment in time where different hundreds of years of different experiences and histories have culminated to this event. So I think that's what I'll leave this with.
Wow, that's again, Emilio, that's a lot to think about, and so very true. So thank you. So, gentlemen, we're kind of winding down here. These panel discussions, they go by really fast. I mean, it's just it flies by, and I think that we could probably keep going with the discussion, because I have a whole bunch of questions I still want to ask. But so in the final moments that we have here, I want to give you just a little bit of time to kind of just maybe share some final thoughts that you might have, that you would like maybe the folks that are viewing this to kind of help a little bit understand more about maybe what they could do, how could they help, or just anything that you want to share about the culture of Asians. I mean, I'll share this really this is a little short story. So before the pandemic, we had our final activity with our Asian community, our advisory committee here, and we had a family event. And it was a big celebration of, just a variety of dances and art and food. And food was the big thing, because one of the ingredients is that I've never been a fan of was curry. Okay, I have a hard time with curry, and I made that known to our advisory committee. And so when they were bringing food in, it was smelling good, and just a variety of different foods, from Vietnamese, Korean, Japanese, Chinese. And there was one lady that was saying, "Oh, Brian, I made this just for you. This is something I really want you to have. It's good. My family loves it. You're gonna love it." So it looked really, really tasty. And I smelled it because I wanted to make sure that I didn't smell curry in it. I didn't smell curry. And so I got a big bowl of it, of this, I think it was like stew, um, and taste it. And there was like some beef in it. I was like, oh man, this is good. And so I'm just womping down on eating this, and everybody started laughing. And I'm like, okay, what's funny here? And so they're having a good time with me, and just say, hey, Brian, you are now eating curry. And and I'm like, okay, you all got me. I knew eventually you were going to get me on this, but I at that moment I realized, you know, even for that, I still have not opened my mind about culture. Even myself as a person of color, there's still much more that I can learn, so much that I need to learn. And I really, it was a kind of a lesson for me that evening. And so now, I'm definitely exploring more and having a lot more of an open mind to things as I learn, and I enjoy, and I feel like I'm the luckiest guy in the world, because I get to work with all of these different multicultural committees that we have here in our school district, and I get to learn something new every single meeting, every single month from all of these groups. So I want to leave this with you as far as, what are some final thoughts or takeaways that you would like to leave with our audience tonight. So I'm going to start off with you, Max.
So this is a loaded question, Brian. But I think that our own communities also need to take some responsibility, and not to fall in love with the seduction of the model minority myths. Like Amy Chua, who wrote The Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother. It's one of the first books I ever wanted to just throw away after I finished reading it, because it perpetuates this seductive feeling that all Asian Americans are lumped into a very successful, we're all good at math, we're good at music, and so forth. And then there's those who want to deny it as much as possible, so they go against it and not doing what's necessarily best for their family. So we need to get away from that. And as a really strong proponent of arts and arts education, John mentioned about the case of the birthright citizenship, and that there's a friend of mine who has written a play, and we hope he brought it here 2 years ago during the 150th celebration. We hope to bring it in again next year. It's called Citizen Wong, and it talks about his struggles to get his birthright citizenship. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court. Another really good friend of mine, I produced a musical 2 years ago called Gold Mountain. It's a love story based on the backdrop of the Sierra Mountains and the reasons why, the push factors of why the Chinese came. There is the Taiping Rebellion in China. Not many people know that at least 25 million people were killed during this Taiping Rebellion, which was the equivalent of the United States population at the time. There's famine and so forth. We know about the Irish famine, but did they know about the Chinese famine? Those are the push factors. And the pull factors, the lure of gold, gamsan, which is still the word used for San Francisco, Gold Mountain. We teach this, that I believe that we don't ever ask anyone to know exactly what it's like to be Asian. I don't know Emilio's experience. His experience is vastly different from mine, and mine with John's. And that's the beauty of it. It's diversity. And there's a lot of great intersections, and there's some bad intersections. Like John mentioned, if you're elderly, and you're a woman, and you're Asian, your percentage of getting attacked are higher. So we want to have, I always believe that art and way we've taught the students, one students at our school here, they put together a comic book, a graphic novel about the experience. And what they did was they learned empathy. They learned what it would be like to be a Chinese rural worker for just a minute, to understand that they were being underpaid to their counterparts. They were nameless because nobody bothered to learn their names. And they learned what are the strengths they had, of tunneling through the mountain, of drinking tea, and because they boiled the water for their tea, that they avoided dysentery, and how they created this great, magnificent railroad, as we are on the 152nd anniversary tonight, that helped build this great nation. So 2 things, again, let's not fall in love with the seduction of the model minority myth, and let's use arts education to help tell the story and create empathy. When you have empathy, I think the world turns just a little bit better.
Awesome. Thank you, Max. Appreciate those thoughts. Emilio, do you have any final thoughts?
Yes, and I think for the Asians and Asian Americans listening in, I just want to say, magpasalamat kayo, natanim kayo sa matabang lupa. Be grateful for your born and fertile soil. Generations of Asians have existed here, and you're not alone. We're here to support. I think it can get pretty isolating, and you feel very alone sometimes here because of the way that it's set up culturally. But we do have community. We have support for you here, so feel free to reach out. For those wanting to support, I think the very first thing is, of course, educate yourselves, commit yourselves to educating yourselves, and learning about the histories and experiences of Asians and Asian Americans, and giving them an opportunity. If you're in a position of power, I think, ask yourselves, how do you create space, programming, and opportunities for Asians to be able to use their own voices? If you oversee budgets, how are you investing and using money into Asian communities? And ask yourselves also, how do Asians exist in your workplace or in your organization? Are they props? Are they tokens? Or do they have their own say? Do they have their own platform, power to be able to share what our communities are going through? And is it just one voice that you're using, or does do these people reflect the breadth and the variety of experiences and histories of our communities? And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Emilio. Appreciate those comments. Okay, John, I'm going to leave it up to you to bring us home.
All right. Well, education is my wheelhouse. It's what I do and it's where I live. And so anybody who's listening and you want to improve the education of your children and make sure that our Asian children are seen and celebrated in our schools, start small and then work your way up. Talk to your child's teacher about diversifying and adding to their classroom library, the books that are there. Ask them if you can come in like Max as just a parent who wants to help educate not just his children, but his community and his school. Can I come in and teach a lesson that speaks to our history? Can I show you how amazing we are and teach this lesson that celebrates this incredible piece of our shared history? It's really hard, like Max was talking about empathy, it's really hard to hate somebody who you respect and admire and whose history you recognize as part of your own. And after you look beyond the school level, look at your district and go to a school board meeting and talk about getting more diverse books, Asian experiences onto the bookshelves, into the curriculum throughout your school district. So that it's not just isolated to one beautiful school, it's disseminated out more. And then look at the state level, talk about standards that open doors to helping our kids see themselves being celebrated in our classrooms across Utah. It's a lot of work, but there's a lot of us doing that work right now. That's what's united the 4 of us here on this call. And just come join us. All right. We're trying really hard to make headway, and we're fighting for our children, for our communities, and there's strength in numbers. So please, if you're listening and you're inspired at all, please get involved.
Thanks a lot, John. I knew that you would do a great job with that. So I want to thank all of you. I think all of you had some great points, and really it just comes down to getting involved. If we're going to make our communities better, got to get involved, our school districts and so forth. And that's what's important, is being involved in the process. And so I appreciate those words. What an amazing night. And so I thank all 3 of you for taking the time this evening to join us. And to those of you, this is the conclusion of our speaker series for this upcoming school year. We do have plans to do this again next school year. We will probably double. We did 3 this year, and we're going to increase that to doing 6 of them next year. I think a lot of it, again, it's all about learning about each other, and we'll have a variety of different people that we'll have and learn from. And I think it's going to be another fascinating year of learning about various cultures and people. And then that's what it's all about. So I want to thank you, everybody, for taking the time to join us this evening here on our Provo City School District Diversity and Equity speaker series. And I hope you have an amazing summer, and we will see you next year. Good night.